B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, September 18th, 2017. Another juvenile tweet storm, or a series of them, from the occupant of the White House leads to some instant analysis from a friend of the Peter B. Collins podcast, psychiatrist Justin Frank from Washington, D.C. Justin Frank is a brilliant man, and he wrote Bush on the Couch, followed by Obama on the Couch. I haven't checked in with him recently, but I believe he's working on Trump on the Couch. But he couldn't wait for publication for this report, which I got via email today. President Trump let loose a veritable tweet storm in the past few days, some original, some retweets. In the words of Donnie Deutsch, these are examples of presidential Tourette. They certainly seem impulsive and at times out of Trump's conscious control. That said, his tweets reveal his compulsion to project, to attribute his own personality propensities to others. He tweeted that we must end terrorism, but the solution he offered reflects Trump's own terrorist mentality. He tweeted that the loser terrorists use the internet as their main recruitment tool, which he said must be cut off. General Kelly was made White House Chief of Staff, Dr. Frank continues, to cut off Trump's excessive use of Twitter. Trump's tweets serve to recruit new support while keeping his base satisfied. In other words, what he does tweet about, when he tweets about terrorists, is a projection of his personal terrorist nature. It also reveals his unconscious denial that he needs to have his own access to the internet cut off and use better. And the analysis continues. His second weekend projection is more menacing than the first. He called Kim Jong-un of North Korea the Rocket Man. And he retweeted a video, a mashup of himself swinging a golf club off the tee and driving that shot into Hillary Clinton's back as she climbs the stairs of an airplane and enters the aircraft and falls over forward. Now, both videos actually occurred. The golf ball hitting Hillary in the back was added to a scene where she tripped over the entry to the aircraft and fell forward. And the sheer meanness of that, and the idea that Trump objects to the fact that Hillary's getting so much media attention around her apology-free book. Oh, there is an apology in it. It's followed by 500 efforts to blame others. And Trump seems to feel that that has taken away from his spotlight in the media. And so on a Saturday night or Sunday morning, he decided to retweet this video piece that came from a guy whose Twitter name is Fucked Up Mind. He spells it a little differently to get it past the censors. And Fucked Up Mind regularly features anti-Semitic and anti-gay tweets, says Dr. Frank. I've never seen this, and as you may know, I have consciously chosen not to follow Donald Trump on Twitter. I don't want to give him any encouragement, and I'm not going to react to every one of these stupid tweets that he blasts. Final comment from Dr. Frank. Our president menaces his own citizens, especially women, impulsively revealing his deepest feelings. At best, he is a man possessed by the mind of a 10-year-old boy with a slingshot. But even so, he happens to be our president. His rocket man is our golf man. And as if that's not enough, the supreme leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Khamenei, has recently taken to Twitter in English. On Sunday, I don't have the exact tweet here depicted in front of me, but his language described American leaders as oppressive, hounding, cruel, corrupt, bullying, liars. Well, I can't challenge the accuracy of Imam Khomeini's commentary. He's also lectured Trump about pulling out of the nuclear deal the six-party nuclear deal with the hashtag wrong move. Now, I can imagine that the Ayatollah is getting some help from somebody else in Iran, but this is it's pointed and it's amusing that he figures that the best way to reach this idiot is in 140 characters on Twitter. And one of the issues here that we see is Trump is spending most of this week at the UN General Assembly. And I cringe to think how many times he will embarrass us. Whether it's the Scotch tape that he uses to keep the short end of his tie from flipping out, or some idiotic comment that he might make and, decide that we're going to launch unilateral military action in Venezuela or something like that. But people are most concerned about the quality time that he'll spend with Benjamin Netanyahu, who is increasingly desperate to distract his civilian population in Israel from his own investigations for corruption, the one of his wife, and the recent Facebook turd that was posted by their son, Yair. And Netanyahu is thundering that the agreement must be changed. Only he didn't try to engage in these negotiations with Iran. He let the United States serve as his proxy. And he took sniper potshots at John Kerry and Barack Obama every step of the way. And even after it was signed, Netanyahu was trying to revise the scope just because he says so. And that's what is up at the United Nations this week, as once again, Netanyahu will try to redefine the terms of an agreement that he didn't participate in and force the United States to front for Israel's grave fears of Iran. Because Israel is determined to be the only nuclear power in the region. That is the real agenda. But it's all dressed up as, the Iranians say death to Israel, wipe it off the map, all that stuff. And Netanyahu describes Iran as a clear and present existential threat to the future of the State of Israel. And I got an email with a column that I think is at the Huffington Post, but I couldn't find a link for you there, from Trita Parsi. And Trita is an expert on Iran. He's president of the National Iranian American Council. Some people suspect that he fronts for U.S. intelligence. I've interviewed him several times, and I find him to be a coherent critic of the Iranian government. But in this case, Trita Parsi is airing out his concerns about what Trump and Netanyahu will agree to at the UN General Assembly in New York this week. And Parsi writes, the Trump plan, as telegraphed by several administration officials, is to certify that Iran is in compliance with the Iranian deal, but to argue that the deal and its sanctions relief nevertheless are unjustified due to Iran's policies in the region that are anathema to U.S. national security interests. Now, this belies the fact that Iran has, in bizarre ways, been helping the U.S. fight the Islamic State in both Iraq and Syria. We all pretend otherwise. And we have Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador, who frequently and probably intentionally misstates the terms of the nuclear deal, and they talk as if it can just be expanded because Trump and Netanyahu want that to be the case. And it was arduously negotiated. As I mentioned, there are 6 nations that are party to the deal. The U.S. and Israel cannot bilaterally decide what the new term should be and then impose them on Iran. It's really crazy. But these are crazy times, and we'll see where all this goes. Now, I'm mildly surprised to report to you that Trump gave a 4-minute speech to the UN General Assembly today, and he appears to have been warming up for this for over a year because he trashes the UN. They waste money. It's a bureaucratic agency. It's not properly accountable. But he put his bluster aside, and he praised the new Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres. And he had pretty diplomatic language that, again, is hard to imagine coming from this guy. We seek a United Nations that regains the trust of the people around the world. In order to achieve this, the UN must hold every level of management accountable, protect whistleblowers. Yeah. Trump's support of whistleblowers is highly selective, and focus on results rather than on process. He didn't say anything about how he wants to cut U.S. support for the United Nations. He backed into that by saying no single member should shoulder a disproportionate share of the burden. And, of course, Trump didn't talk about the Syrian refugee crisis triggered by U.S. regime change policies in the Middle East. He didn't talk about the plight of the Rohingyas, who are being forced out of Myanmar and into what is essentially a prison camp in Bangladesh. That's my next story. And Trump's agenda will likely be very different from the concerns of the members of the General Assembly and people like you and me. He's going to want to pound North Korea, and he also will want to try to reshape the United Nations based on some bizarre ideas that he or his associates have on the brilliant Trump team. So, as I mentioned, Myanmar has basically expelled at least 400,000 Rohingya minorities from Myanmar into neighboring Bangladesh. Bangladesh, an impoverished country in its own right, has announced that they will build 10 new settlements. No, actually, it's 14,000 shelters over the next 10 days, and they have put aside 2,000 acres in an area called Cox's Bazar, which is near the Bangladesh-Myanmar border. And when you hear the restrictions that the government has announced, Rohingya will not be able to drive a vehicle or even ride in a vehicle. The Rohingya refugees will not be allowed to go outside the camp. They will be housed 6 families to a tent, and there will be some 14,000 of those tents. And it's unclear where food, water, and the basic necessities of life will come from and who will pay for it. Perhaps that will be a discussion at the UN this week. But this is a critical crisis driven by ethnic cleansing. And one of the people who will not be at the UN is the leader of Myanmar, the Nobel Prize-winning activist who wrested control from the military dictatorship there into what passes for a fledgling democracy. And her name's hard to pronounce, but Aung San Suu Kyi is ducking the UN General Assembly so that she can preside over the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya minority. This is truly tragic, and with 65 million displaced individuals in the world today, it's absolutely shameful that the prosperous, so-called free world does so little to help those who are in the deepest kind of distress right now. Interesting story in today's New York Times, and the byline includes a man I respect, science writer William Broad. Bill Broad teamed up with David Sanger, the Washington bureau chief, to report that the missile fuel that is believed to be in use in North Korea today, which is called UDMH, and somewhere here it tells me what UDMH stands for. It is short for unsymmetrical dimethyl hydrazine. This is a very volatile fuel. Russia used it to launch rockets, but they discontinued it at least 20 years ago. Russia refers to UDMH as the devil's venom. And so the question is, where did North Korea get the chemicals to create UDMH rocket fuel? Speculation is it came from China and or Russia. And according to this article, back in 2008, when Condoleezza Rice was Secretary of State, she signed a secret memo, October of 2008, warning that the North had obtained an engine powered by UDMH that represents a substantial advance in North Korea's liquid propellant technology. But all the efforts that are public, and certainly during the Obama years there may have been secret communications indicating that we were well aware that UDMH is the preferred jet fuel, rocket fuel for North Korea. But the indications are that the U.S. has never made any effort, despite the sanctions that we have been imposing and using over the years, to try to restrict the export of the chemicals that make UDMH to North Korea. Now, it did show up on some sanctions list, I'm told, in like 2012 or 2014. Here it is twice. In 12 and 14, the fuel was included in the UN Security Council lists of prohibited export items. But experts say that few paid attention to the fine print of those sanctions. And while the U.S. has led this new round of sanctions that curtail, they don't completely eliminate, the export of natural gas and either crude oil or refined oil products, gasoline or diesel, we apparently are able to reduce the flow of those energy products into North Korea, but that will affect consumers. And one of Trump's tweets about the Rocket Man was that they've got long gas lines in North Korea now. Well, that is not going to affect their missile program. So we will see if we learn more about UDMH and efforts to restrict its transfer to North Korea. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast. And as I do, I want to update you on a longtime subscriber and a very generous supporter of this podcast, Bob Donjicour of San Francisco. Just about a year ago, Bob had a critical bicycle accident in San Francisco, and ironically, it occurred after he had returned. It was less than a week after he had returned from an epic bike ride. He rode, I think, to the Continental Divide in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and rode back to San Francisco. And he chronicled that journey on Facebook on a daily basis. And I've never met Bob Donjicour, but we've communicated by email, and I knew him as a great supporter of this podcast. Well, he was in a state of suspended consciousness for many months, and I had grave concerns that Bob Donjicour would not survive the incident that occurred just about a year ago. And recently, I went to a web page where the family updates his progress, and I was thrilled to see that he was just about to be released from a rehabilitation hospital. And yesterday on Facebook, family members posted pictures of Bob Donjicour strolling down Herb Cain Way. That's on the Embarcadero, the waterfront here in San Francisco. And right now, as I tell you this, I'm feeling a little tingle just of the real thrill at the knowledge that Bob has survived. Now, I'm not aware of his state of mind. I do believe he suffered extreme memory loss, and it's possible he doesn't remember Peter B. or the podcast. And that's not important to me. What is important is that one of my stalwart supporters has lived through a near-fatal event. And I congratulate Bob and his family for his recovery so far. Let me also thank Joe Clarici, Brian Massey, Benny Alto, and Arlene Montemarano. They're stalwart supporters of the podcast, and I invite you to join in as well. Come on over to peterbcollins.com, click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber, and when you get to the sign-up page, the options are right there. Pick one that fits your budget, and the level of support you would like to offer. Chelsea Manning, as we reported on Friday, was invited as a visiting fellow to Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And then Mike Pompeo, the current CIA director and a Harvard alum, he flaked out. He stiffed Harvard just an hour before he was supposed to speak at the Kennedy School. And Mike Morrell, a former acting CIA director who was a visiting fellow at a different institute at Harvard, resigned with a public statement on Thursday. And I find it really disgusting that, as Bob Perry puts it, and we'll quote him in a moment, likely war criminals, in Mike Morrell's case, we can put away the likely, succeeded in pressuring Harvard to uninvite Chelsea Manning and to bump her down to, they said, we'll allow her to speak, but we are withdrawing the $1,000 stipend and the honorific title of visiting fellow. Well, over the weekend, at the Nantucket Project off the coast of Massachusetts, Cape Cod, Chelsea Manning was interviewed in public. She said, so this is one of the American government institutions, the CIA, telling one of the American academic institutions, Harvard, no, you cannot bring this to your school. And that's what that was. This is a police state. This is a military intelligence, and it is a police state in which we can no longer engage in actual political discourse in our institutions. Our institutions have no discussion, she added. Later, she said that she took a risk to contribute to political and public discourse and change the tone of the conversation, but that it hadn't changed, and if anything, things have gotten worse. I'm walking out of prison, and I see literally a dystopian novel unfolding before my eyes. That's how I feel when I walk in the American streets today. I'm honored to be the first disinvited trans woman to be to the Harvard University Fellowship Program, and I am. I'm honored, she said. I don't view that as something I'm ashamed of. I view it as just as much an honor and distinction as the fellowship itself. Good for you, Chelsea. And later on, she said that she will continue to speak out. She said, everybody keeps telling me, maybe you shouldn't say this, maybe you shouldn't do this event, maybe you shouldn't talk, maybe you shouldn't do this. And I'm just like, okay, the fact you're telling me I shouldn't do this is the reason why I should. And I think that's what we all can do. Right on, Chelsea. And as I mentioned, Bob Perry's piece in defense of Chelsea Manning is pretty strong. His subhead reads that Harvard's Kennedy School withdrew a fellowship from Manning after hearing protests from accomplices in the war crimes she exposed. A couple of quotes from Perry. After serving in Iraq as an Army intelligence analyst witnessing the often cavalier attitude toward killing Afghans and Iraqis, Manning decided to release thousands of classified documents, including what WikiLeaks labeled the collateral murder video of a U.S. helicopter gunship mowing down Iraqis and 2 Reuters journalists on a Baghdad street. Manning's decision was an act of moral courage at a time when American officialdom was violating a host of international laws with impunity. Indeed, what was almost as troubling as the war crimes themselves was that virtually no one from the presidencies of Bush and Obama was punished for their criminal actions, especially for committing what the Nuremberg tribunals deemed the supreme international crime, the crime of aggressive war. And he notes that people like Sean Spicer and Corey Lewandowski and other ilk have been invited and given these fellowships at Harvard. And referring to Mike Morrell, Perry quotes our friend, former CIA analyst Ray McGovern. Like many senior CIA officials in recent years, Morrell's record is checkered at best. He held key jobs in intelligence analysis over the past decade, as the CIA often served as a handmaiden to the war propagandists. And later, Bob Perry notes that the fact that everything that Morrell proposed, and he quotes an interview on the Charlie Rose show last year, where Morrell said he wanted to kill Russians in Syria to make them pay a price. He wanted to kill Iranians in Syria to make them pay a price. And following that, Perry says the fact that everything Morell was proposing violated international law didn't seem to faze Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. The idea of killing Russians and Iranians inside Syria could be construed as terrorism. But even that doesn't raise eyebrows these days. Although if some senior Russian or Iranian went on TV to propose killing Americans in, say, Iraq or Afghanistan to send Washington a message, that would surely draw righteous condemnation. And his closer? By honoring the likes of Morell and dishonoring the likes of Manning, Harvard has sent a clear message regarding how it sees the role of the U.S. government in the world. The school is signaling that it embraces the moral hypocrisy at the core of this attitude and is demonstrating that it can be trusted to train future U.S. government leaders in how to operate outside the norms of civilized behavior. And speaking of the norms of civilized behavior, Lindsey Graham and Bill Cassidy, Republican members of the United States Senate, are making one last-ditch effort to scuttle Obamacare. And it's fascinating to see the reaction to this. The Republicans said in part they did this because Bernie Sanders introduced his Medicare for All bill. And to that, Trump tweeted over the weekend that we don't need to worry because he will veto single payer because he loves America. How twisted is that? At any rate, Graham and Cassidy are trying to bring to the Senate floor, with no committee hearings, with no scoring from the Congressional Budget Office on what it would cost, who would lose coverage, etc., in a clear dereliction of the fundamental duty of a U.S. Senator. They are trying to make one more political move to undermine Obamacare. And it once again produces strange bedfellows. Rand Paul said he wouldn't vote for this because it leaves too much of Obamacare in place. John McCain, featured on another Sunday morning TV show, he is the #1 invitee. He kind of rewrote history, saying that Obamacare is failing because it was rammed through with Democrat votes only. But, of course, the Republicans were united only in opposition to the black guy reforming health care in this country. And that's why there were no Republican votes. It wasn't because Democrats failed to attempt compromise or bipartisanship. That's my biggest beef with Obama on the Affordable Care Act. He prevented any negotiation over prescription drugs. He didn't put any cost control measures into it. And he kept pleading for Republicans to support the measure as he kept watering it down. No public option. No, you can't even allow John Conyers to come to a White House meeting to even float the idea of single payer. Anyway, this is another ugly bill. They're lying to try to pass it. Here is Cassidy, the co-sponsor. He says right now 37% of the revenue from the Affordable Care Act goes to Americans in 4 states, California, New York, Massachusetts, and Maryland. Now, he says that is not fair. Well, he doesn't really explain that many Republican-controlled states refused to opt into Obamacare. They rejected the Medicaid benefits for the poorest individuals in their states and let them suffer. And so now to claim that because the most populous states, California and New York, and Democratic states like Massachusetts and Maryland, who participated in the Affordable Care Act, are getting a disproportionate share of the money, this is irrational bullshit, and it is so offensive to hear it. And the Cassidy-Graham bill includes a lot of the ugly elements of the earlier failed attempts to repeal Obamacare, including allowing watered-down insurance, federal waivers for higher premiums for sick people, limited benefits like maternity care or mental health care. It's as ugly as the previous ones. And hopefully it will meet the same fate and die on the Senate floor. Interesting investigation of the opioid epidemic reveals that the health insurance companies, the ones that are propped up in Obamacare and insured profitable customer bases, well, insurance regulations appear to have played a role in the opioid crisis because insurance companies will allow people to get a prescription for OxyContin, for example, but they make it harder to get less addictive drugs, painkillers like Butrans. And when they allow doctors to write a prescription for long-acting morphine with no questions asked, because it only costs $29 a month, when a more expensive product that is less addictive costs $300 or $400 a month? Well, this is really another example of the utter failure of profit-taking in the delivery of medical care in this country. And to allow these companies to jigger the regulations to basically point people toward addiction. And then they put restrictions on who can get addictive care, who can get the drugs that help you wean off addiction. Yes, they put barriers in front of those patients as well. It's sick, twisted, and insidious, and it will continue for the foreseeable future. Well, we are threatened here in the Bay Area with another free speech event at the University of California, Berkeley, scheduled for this coming weekend. Ann Coulter, Milo Yiannopoulos, and Steve Bannon. Now, late on Friday, the organizers of the event signed a contract and submitted it to the university, but they didn't provide payment. They are supposed to kick in an unknown amount of money, could be as much as $100,000 to pay for rent and security. But they appear to be playing hardball with the university, and we'll see how that plays out over the coming days. Last night I broke tradition, and I actually watched most of the Emmy Awards. I don't care that much about the Emmys. I don't watch that much television of the entertainment variety. But Stephen Colbert was the host, and Alec Baldwin was likely to win, so I multitasked and had it on in the background. And it was pretty political. There were a lot of jabs taken at Trump, and I heard Rush Limbaugh licking his wounds while chattering about the alleged low ratings of the broadcast last night. But Colbert had a great opener. He noted that Trump was the biggest TV star of the year, that he had accused in the past the Emmys of being rigged because he never won an Emmy for his TV show, The Apprentice. And when Alec Baldwin won his award for playing Trump on Saturday Night Live, he got to the podium and he said, at long last, Mr. President, here is your Emmy. I was also pleased to see that John Oliver won 2 Emmys for his HBO Sunday night show. And it rankled the daily hosts like Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel, who were there kind of tweaking John Oliver for picking up 2 awards. And finally, we get the news over the weekend that Jan Wenner is ready to give up Rolling Stone. He founded it in San Francisco almost 50 years ago. It's had a checkered history. I never subscribed to Rolling Stone. They used to send it to me free, and there have been occasional great articles in there. People point to Hunter Thompson, most recently to Matt Taibbi. But the really stinky part of this is that last week, Jan Wenner sold his other 2 existing publications, Us Weekly and whatever that other rag was, to the people who own the National Enquirer. And the Enquirer's ownership is described as a prominent bidder for Rolling Stone. They're called American Media, and the other publication that was sold last week was Men's Journal. So if I were Jan Wenner, I would rather shut down Rolling Stone than sell it off to the goons of the National Enquirer. But I'm not Jan Wenner. I'm Peter B. Collins, and I thank you for listening to my daily news and comment podcast.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.